everybody. Welcome to Pealed Back's LiveCast Conversations with. As always, I'm your host, Gene Bernier, the Enjoyment Coach. And on episode 56, I get to feature my friend, Shane Lapp. Shane is a professional engineer and entrepreneur who spent a decade at the forefront of renewable and sustainable energy. In 2009, Shane became the first employee and a partner in a waste-to-energy power development firm valued at over $100 million in its second year. Then in 2016, he co-founded a software company and simultaneously started his graduate studies in community depth psychology, from which he received a master's degree. Shane has spent 3 years of his Ph.D. studies in Transitional Economics, which led to the forming of the Okanagan Circular Society. The OCS is an initiative focused on co-creating a regenerative, just, peaceful, and equitable community in the Okanagan through integrating circular practices and organizational patterns that tap creativity, foster well-being, and advance the community resilience. The team is currently developing and refining their blueprint for economic transformation. Shane, my words can only do you so much justice, sir. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, Gene, it's a pleasure to be here. I know we've been chatting a while, and you invited me to be here, I think last fall or early winter, and so it felt like the timing was well aligned to be here today. So
Perfect.
Much appreciation, and stoked to be in this conversation.
Well, tell us a little bit about how you've gotten to the journey that you are with the Okanagan Circular Society. It's quite the story behind getting to where it is today.
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple levels, multiple dimensions to that journey. As you mentioned in the introduction, I'm a professional engineer, so my background is actually designing green buildings, renewable energy plants. So as basically a systems engineer, and then had an incredible opportunity in business where I was trained by a very successful venture capitalist and learned a lot about the inner workings of business. Also had to unlearn some of the more unhealthy practices that come with high growth corporations within often a venture capitalistic framework. And so 5 years ago, I answered somewhat of an intuitive call and found myself going back and forth for 3 years to California, sunny Santa Barbara, at this really amazing school called Pacifica in a tradition of depth psychology. And depth psychology is really the study of the unconscious. This is Jungian psychology, indigenous psychologies, eco-psychologies. And through this kind of combination of systems engineering, sustainability, business, and community psychology, and community psychology is really the systems, the political, the economic, the social systems that determine the individual, the collective, and the environmental well-being, brought together a group in partnership with the Okanagan CoLab. And so CoLab has really been a big champion of a lot of the work I've been doing. And interestingly enough, it's actually their 10-year anniversary today, September 15th. And
wow.
So I can share more about the journey of co-creating the Okanagan Circular Society with CoLab. But yeah, CoLab and Shane Austin have been significant community leaders and champions. And as you'll learn, this initiative is gaining national attention. So it's really cool to see local initiatives here with an organization that's 10 years old.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Big congratulations to Shane Austin and what he's created there. So it's definitely something very neat. If you're in the Okanagan, definitely go check out the CoLab.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's kind of like jump into how you were able to start your journey, talking a little bit about like the design process that you hosted through the CoLab and where that's taken, where it's now grown into this Okanagan Circular Society.
Yeah, absolutely. It was last September, so it was just over a year ago. Pitched the idea to Shane to do a 6-week design lab, and we from that invited 40 community leaders, economic development leads, CEOs of key organizations, sustainability consultants, community experts. And there was about 10 of us that did this 6-week journey. And so the first 3 weeks were about building relationships, sharing visions of possibility, exploring shadow, so some of the challenges that are existing within existing organizations and structures. And over that first 3 weeks, we read some articles, which was based on some of my research around transitional economics and community well-being, psychological wholeness. And with that foundation in the first 3 weeks, we moved into the last 3 weeks, which were an accelerated design process, asking what would we do if we had $5 million to create a scalable model of a regenerative, sustainable community platform.
Wow.
And so that's where the Okanagan Circular Society was birthed from.
Well, maybe before we get too much further down with the story, like, can we backtrack a little bit and talk about, like, what does it mean when you talk about transitional economics and circular conversations, or, and you also mentioned something about shadow work in there. So how does all that play together, and, like, what does it mean for the people who've never heard of anything like this before?
Yeah, and that was one of the reasons I was really happy to come on this conversation with you, Gene. I know you're really big into men's health and well-being, and you also understand business, and if you understand business, you understand economics. And when we look at economics, we can see that we're in an economic system that prioritizes profits over people and the well-being of our planet. And when we look at it as a pattern, it's a triangular pattern where power and wealth starts to get concentrated at the top of our economic systems, and that same pattern is throughout our organizations, and it's even internal to how we operate from a psychological perspective, from a depth psychological lens. And so transitional economics, there's a lot of movement, like circular economics, which is really great. It's the full life cycle, the full utilization of resources, so from cradle to reusing. And if you look at that from an indigenous or an ecological lens, it doesn't actually shift the underlying pattern that's at the root of a lot of our cultural imbalances. And so transitional economics, it can be viewed in various different lenses, but really moving it into that a living system, which doesn't, it reflects indigenous and ecological systems. So instead of that triangular pattern where power and wealth are concentrated at the top, it's more of a circular pattern that distributes power and wealth, and utilizing the system that we're working within and co-creating. It uses 98% of all the things that are awesome about the current market system, and just integrates it into a holistic community framework.
It's really interesting on like how that comes about. The thing for me that kind of struck out from your initial conversation about spending the 3 weeks building relationship is, like, can you get a little bit more depth into how you use, like, this circle practice to break through and create some really deep relationships where you were able to accelerate as a group into, like, taking 3 weeks to, like, design something. Most people would look at going, oh, you spent 3 weeks just kind of getting to know each other. But I think that was the most magical component of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was 6 weeks. We met each week Wednesday night for 2 hours. And the first week, we invited participants to bring something of meaning. And before we get into that, I'll share. So we used a circle format, and so circle formats really it's a practice, a process it's inherent within ecological cultures, indigenous cultures, and circles honor the equality of voice. They create a space for listening, a space for really seeing the deeper aspects that each of us bring into our being and into our experience. And so to start it off, we shared just a general overview of circle practice, some of the intentions behind it, speaking from the heart, listening deeply, being brief with our words, but also conveying the intention that we want. And we transitioned with a meditation to really center and earth ourselves. And the first question, I think, was around, what compelled you to be in a conversation for 6 weeks about community well-being? What do you see possible? And so it was really the sharing of vision, sharing of possibility, because of the 10 people participating, each came with their own background of skills and gifts that were really seen and honored. And then answering the question of, what was this meaningful piece of item that you brought to share with the community? It really created that space of, oh, well, here's more than just the professional facade that I put on. And we didn't even ask people to introduce their professional career. So people were shocked at the end when they found out we had one of Canada's leading climate scientists in there, and a CEO that had an MBA from Yale. And so
Oh, wow.
we were just regular people coming together for a meaningful conversation.
That's really interesting to hold that. And then you held the kind of the reveal at the end of the 6 weeks where everyone's like, oh yeah, by the way, this is what I do.
Yeah. It
That's
wasn't
kind of neat.
about the professional. Often that when that's put forth, sometimes that intimidates people or carries more weight than necessary. And so,
Right.
the format itself created a space for people to be seen and heard, and a lot of creative juices to flow.
Right. So with it, reading through some of the documents that you shared is like you talked about everyone getting to have their voice heard, which is awesome. But there was a component of it where it seemed like how did you word it? Is like it wasn't like unanimous consent, but everybody had to get to alignment to the topic. How I'm butchering it. I can only imagine. But can you talk a little bit about how you're using that circle practice to find alignment that everyone around that circle can go, yes, we agree on this, without getting stuck in like a traditional like we need 100% and one person's a holdout.
Yeah. And just for reference, the documents that Gene's mentioning here is our blueprint for economic transformation, which we had funding from Social Innovation Canada, and then also our economic transformation plan, which is basically a business plan. And so very comprehensive, and there's a lot in there. We were emailing back and forth this morning, and so there's a lot of components, and Circle itself is multifaceted. It's not just a matter of sitting in circle and hearing each other talk, and that's an important. And in our first 3 weeks, that was really the focus. When we moved into design, we had a different format than what you're talking about there. But when it comes into organizational models, and so this really gets into transitioning away from managers, bosses, supervisors, the traditional model that we're used to, and this is really a colonial construct, and this circular model of governance, of organizing self-distributed living systems, complex adaptive systems, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
Circles are integral in it, and it's actually ways for teams to self-organize. And so each member of the circle has clarity of roles, accountabilities, and purposes that they're aiming to fill. And so in an organization, there might be 10, 20, 100 different circles, and you might be a part of different circles filling different roles, and those teams then have the capacity to change how decisions get made, how the authority flows, and processes and practices. And so where you were going with that, Gene, as far as often it's thought of consensus, so 100% of people agreeing on a path forward. I often think about different forms of democracy. And so consensus 100% is a form of democracy. Majority rule is a form of democracy. And so in circles, they use a form of consent. So a decision or a proposal is passed when there's no objections. And So you can raise an objection, and again, there's a circle process to hear reactions to proposals, tensions that might arise. And if there's an objection, then there's a process to integrate that objection into a final decision. And and some objections are just, they're not valid, but the whole process ensures that all voices are heard within this decision. And it also means that you may not get exactly what you want, but it's within a range of tolerance that's acceptable. And so, what
Right.
this enables is quick decision making, iterative, and high transparency, which also means high trust. And when there's trust and transparency and the capacity for people to make meaningful decisions, there's much higher engagement, much higher passion that goes into decisions and organizations.
Right. So if everyone's got like, if everyone then has a opportunity to, I'll use your words, co-create this each and every decision, and as a team, as a circle, do you use the word team or group? Like, what's the proper like
Circle.
circle? So as a circle of people that are involved in this operational component, they all have a say in that, and they all then choose together how they're going to make decisions. And each time that they make one, learning and potentially augmenting and just becoming a very efficient within holding space for each other, dealing with tensions, and still moving forward.
Yeah, and the nice thing about it as well is that with the clarity of accountabilities and purpose and kind of a domain of your area, each role has its full autonomy to fulfill its purpose, its role to the best of its capacity. And when it starts to bump up against other people's roles or other circles that are outside of the current circle, that's when there's this governance process for teams and circles to modify the approach. And so that's where, instead of the top-down change management, which we're often used to, or this notion of designing cultures, these type of systems, the culture emerges as one of inclusion and often high performance, very high performance,
Right.
because of the psychological fabric that goes into it. And so, yeah, so that's kind of the basic components there of it.
And it's interesting, like you mentioned psychological, but like the word psychological safety has to be like woven really through this whole practice for people to be, to feel like they're in a space that they can voice or potentially, take a step and it not be the right one, and still be safe within the circle itself, within the rest of their peers.
Yeah. And that's really woven within the governance practice, how these governance meetings are held, how a facilitator. So there's times when a facilitator will cut people off and say, "Whoa, that's not your time to talk. This person right now is giving their reaction." And so the facilitated process ensures that each voice has that room to
Right.
express without being cut off. And so, yeah, the process of self-governance, I usually don't use the word psychological safety, but within circle and circle practices, that's an inherent space. And so
Right.
you could even expand that out to diversity, inclusion, equity at the realm of thought, and the distribution of power and decision making.
Right. So it's still in the center of that circle, there's some form of facilitator who's helping hold the space. And use the word governance quite a lot. So when there's self-organizing, as at these circles are self-organizing, are they then like building their own governance, or like is there like a greater umbrella to that?
Yeah, so there's various different systems. And so when we talk self-governance, there's kind of two key systems that we're integrating within our practice. The first one's sociocracy, and the second one is a derivative of that called holacracy. And so holacracy has basically an operating manual. They call it a constitution of how these circles operate, who makes the decisions within that, what's the role of the facilitator, the secretary, how objections get processed. And so there's a very clear process within that. And holacracy would say it's also a management system. because it then provides clarity of who's doing the work, where each project's at. And so it's very real time. The information is continually cultivated in a pattern and a practice that's consistent throughout an organization. And one of the co-creators of the OCS, and I've done the training on both of those systems, but Phil, who actually met in the collab here, he's been working remote for a tech company for, I think it was 2 years, and he was employee 6 or 7, and they transitioned fairly quickly into the holacracy system and tripled in size without bosses and managers within 2 years. And he loved it. He was like, this is everything I've been looking for, because I don't need a boss and a manager, and this gives me the freedom and the flexibility to do what I want. And if there's something that I see of possibility, I can bring it to the group and get the buy-in to explore it. And so it creates this really entrepreneurial, innovative environment where a lot of those ideas get stifled in traditional hierarchical systems.
Yeah. No, I've seen that in all shapes and sizes of startups and other companies I've been part of, where best intentions always kind of get like locked on that one person who's like, this is my way or the highway, and I'm the big boss and I get to be this guy. And it's they'll kill things more often than not. But it's interesting to be like, to hear that you've got somebody that's worked in that area and made and was witnessed it switch over. Like that's a real big commitment from like that the previous leadership team to go, this is what we're going to do, and we have such faith in the system and how it will empower everybody to move it forward. Because like change is never easy. But like what was it, not to derail away from the OCS, but like how long did it take that company to make kind of that switch to where they were running in that system fairly well?
It's a good question. And so they were, I think they were around 10, a team of 10. The 3 owners of the company were very motivated to do it. They had someone in-house that learned the practice and helped others learn it. And so, it is a practice. So there's an awkward learning phase at the start. And with good guidance, good mentoring, good coaching, that process goes fairly smoothly. And the reality is it takes 3, 4, 5, 6 months to get good at it, and probably a year to get proficient at it. And this is really an opportunity for us on scale to relearn how to self-govern ourselves, because it's a muscle, and over our lifetime and over our past generations, probably for the past 500 years of colonization, and more than 500 years in Europe, we kind of squashed that self-governing practices, and so there's a real opportunity to relearn how to self-govern ourselves, both on small scale and large scale, and there's a learning curve to that for sure.
Oh yeah. So where do you see is the best, how are you and the OCS team going to take this to start deploying this? Like where do you see this being the place that you can go in for 6 months to a year and really make an impact? Because obviously this kind of change is going to have to start, you have to pick a small spot that you can get a bit of an anchor hold on to go, look, we've got this proof, because there's going to be early adopters and you got the chasm of adoption. So how do we get to a point where it's going to have such mass appeal and such an easy transition period that it's a no-brainer for anybody else in a position of power, where they almost get left out if they're not part of the transformation?
Love that question. And let me back up just a little bit, because I didn't quite fill in all the blanks of what the OCS is, the Okanagan Circular Society. And so what we created as a group at the end of those 6 weeks, in its simplest, is a nonprofit, a federal not-for-profit, which owns for-profit businesses. And we chose a federal not-for-profit in consultation with Fasken Law, because it can download powers within the Not-for-Profit Act Section 138A, not that that matters. And so the 4 pillars within the OCS, first one is a community lab. The second one is venture builder. Third one is community investment funds. And then the fourth one is self-governance, which Jean and I were just talking about. And so community lab is really a place of experimentation, community coming together. And I'm doing this live cast today from CoLab, who is the natural fit for the community lab with 10 years of experience and national leading initiative here. So that's community lab. Venture builder is actually, I think you were part of a venture builder, Gene. It's
I was, yeah.
yeah. So it's basically a holding co. Instead of a venture capitalist, if you had $100 million, instead of just investing $10 million into a company, you might invest $5 million, but bring $5 million of resources, of communications, marketing, experience, team, all of these different capacities that then ensure that businesses have a higher chance of success. And so we've just brought that into this not-for-profit, for-profit framework. And then an equity structure and ownership structure that honors traditional investing returns, the original entrepreneurs, friends, family, venture capital, angel investors with typical type returns, and then also community investment funds. One of our partners, the Community Foundations of Canada, who have $6.5 billion across the nation, 100% of that money, well, close to it, is sitting in the stock market, perpetuating systems of inequality and unsustainability. And so to build out a model that we're talking about it and to scale it and replicate it to other communities is really an opportunity to bring meaningful amounts of money and financial energy into this system. And so, yeah, to build it out, I mean, Gene, this is really the opportunity for the Okanagan is to build a pilot of this system. And so we've laid out a 4-staged approach. And the first stage is really building the foundation, the legal fabric, the acquisition plan of CoLab, and a couple of the businesses that we have in the hopper. Phase 2 really brings those businesses into this framework to build them, to grow them, to prove out the model, work through the kinks, learn it, develop the venture builder capacity, which, Gene, by the way, you might be a phenomenal lead for that. And then also figure out the investment structures.
Right.
Phase 3 is really working more at the community dialogue, working with organizations that are still working in the colonial hierarchy, and starting to transition that at a larger community. And then phase 4 is really the reinvestment back into community with organizations that and approaches that are in this transformative framework.
Right.
And so, yeah, we're moving into the phase of doing consulting for organizations to prep them for acquisition, so that they're operating with circle practices, self-governance, and then working to build that the financial infrastructure to bring those organizations in. And so,
Right.
our intention over the next 5 years, we can envision 800 businesses, 300 million in equity, and 10 million being reinvested back into community each year, and creating practices that create a sense of belonging. That, you know, we touched on the shadow work that starts to dissolve those root causes of psychological imbalances, or one of the causes, and creating that larger system, integrated system of wholeness.
Yeah. Well, like, reading your plan, like the amount of jobs that you could potentially just create with one of these things within a community was like substantial. Like it's not a small amount of change that you could make within the next decade.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of that is transitioning existing organizations into this framework. But I mean, we can envision 10, 15, 20,000 people here in the Okanagan working within this type of system as we learn how to redirect the financial energy into this holistic system. And so if you've got 10, 20, 100,000 people that are learning how to self-govern, how to be in circle, how to witness the deeper aspects of each other, starting to dissolve those psychological imbalances. That starts to make significant transformative potential throughout the community. And then, if these start to replicate across the nation, you can start to see how a simple pattern starts to create a transformative scale.
Right.
And I know Canada wants to be at the forefront of, leading a new type of economy that's sustainable. And I think that's where some of the national parties that are looking at the OCS are really seeing that potential as well.
Yeah, no, I think it was really neat. Like, as you're talking, but as well have seen the graph or like the diagrams of how it all works. Is like basically you're starting to throw a rock into the ocean and watching the ripples go out. And every time you add more onto each of your venture built, like those 4 pieces, getting more ripples. And then as you add more of these across the nation, more ripples, and they start to make a wider impact. And as well, like you talk about like dissolving the psychological components for people. Anybody who's working in this, all of a sudden they might not be hating work as much, or they might be excited about going to work. Like, what's just the ripple within their family? What's the ripple within their top 10 people that are around? Be like, oh, you're happier, you're excited. What's going on? How do I be part of this? Like, it's incredible, just the chain reaction that type of experience could have.
Yeah, it's so Circle is also called Council, and so my professor and my friend Dr. Kelly Law, she's actually the head of council for Snapchat Inc. And so last year in 2020, in a year of COVID lockdowns, racial tensions, they did 3,000 small circles for their 5,000 employees. And so when people were feeling isolated and afraid, they had a format and a practice that they had already developed over the past 3-5 years to come together to share their, the fears, their anxieties, all this type of stuff, and to have that feeling of connection. And then when racial tensions arose, Kelly was saying that they processed an amazing amount of historical angst and anger as that arose last spring. And through that, a bunch of other organizations reached out to her in Snapchat and said, hey, we want to do this. And she was like, you can't just do this. This has taken us years to develop this type of relationship to be able to have these conversations. And and so it's, like I say, it's a practice. It's an ongoing relational experience that it takes. There's we have a lifetime, and there's generations of injustice that is throughout our culture and our society, and it takes a while to dissolve those.
Yeah. Well, you saying the word practice, and after this conversation, like the meaning's changed a little bit for me. It's like, instead of it's like, oh, coaching's my practice. Be like, no, like these things that I'm doing are practice, where practice is an opportunity to try, to learn. If you stumble, pick yourself back up, try, learn, and stumble again. Is like, it's a very subtle shift, but that's really sitting with me. And hopefully that sits with the other people that are out here listening to it as you take in new ways of going about your life and your business and everything else. Is like, treat it as practice.
Absolutely. And I liked what you shared. I think it was before we went live here, but you were saying how each live cast, you want to be 1% better, and bringing that type of philosophy into, the practice of life, and then bring it into a transformative system.
Oh, big time, right? Like, and I was saying beforehand, like we're at episode 56, and I wouldn't have been where I am if I wasn't able to do just 1% better instead of waiting for it to be perfect all the time.
Where's that? There, our economic transformation plan and our blueprint for economic transformation. I mean, Gene, we've been having these conversations for 3 years, and they were pretty rudimentary at the start. They were conceptual, and now the bones are there, the meat's on it. Sometimes things seem like a lofty goal, and you just keep moving towards it with consistency, and things start to take form in really, professional, coherent ways.
Yeah. So how can a company, if there's leaders out there watching this going, yes, I this speaks to me. Where do they get started? Like, what's their first step aside from reaching out to you and getting connected and understanding it at a deeper level?
Yeah, I mean, as a starting point, I think the Holacracy website is really good, holacracy.org. Google Sociocracy, so Sociocracy for All. There's some really good overview videos of just what that looks like and how it actually is operationalized in an organization in practice. Right. And yeah, I mean, we're very much available for organizations. And something that I really realized is that there's a lot of unconscious elements that are happening in organizations that sometimes frustrate this transition into self-governance and circular. And so we often recommend going through a similar 6-week kind of process, 6-week circle design. Right. Build those relationships, start to cultivate maybe those things that haven't necessarily been shared or there wasn't a space for it. And as a group, start to co-create what's possible for an organization. And just to get that feel of interconnectedness. Gene, when we did our first circle as the Circle Design Lab, at the end of the circle, it was a palpable feel. And it was around the circle. People were like, I can't believe how connected I feel to people through Zoom and in this space, people that they had never met before in a lot of cases. And so just to create that sense of connection and a space to share some of those ideas is really start of kind of a rich root system for these larger transformations.
Yeah, well, it's definitely, the more that you can create that space for that is like, I'm doing something similar called Open Forum, and we've got like a set of men that are been consistent with coming up, and like the areas that we go into, I never would have expected it to go the way that it has, but it's been cultivated in a way that nobody's ever been outcast or anything else, or there's never been like disparaging remarks. It's just been like, let's bring everything up to the table. And usually we walk away with something that's really awesome. And everyone's like, yeah, love it. And, before the Corona happened here, like I remember sitting in one of those that you hosted earlier on, and it was, I can vouch for that. You definitely walk away going very heart opened.
Yeah. And, it was interesting then in the second one when we started to look at the shadow side, and Allison, who's a leading climate scientist, she was like, yes, this is the actual deep work. And for the 2 hours, you could see where people were comfortable in that space and where some people were very like, oh, this is business. This is a community. Why are we talking about this type of stuff? And it created that discomfort, and so through this journey, there was almost a journey of sensations where you're like, you feel connected and it's palpable, but then at other times you're like, oh, this is uneasy, and yet with a practice that holds that, that's where things really open up in possibility.
It's like our friend Raul James talks about it. Everything happens beyond the discomfort, right? So
100%. And I think we're seeing more and more, especially now, the importance of being able to voice and making sure that all voices are heard. And we see the implications when that doesn't happen.
No, and I'm, like I say, I'm stoked that you were on this episode, and just so much going on and some great takeaways for people to do and sit with. And I'm super excited to see where you take this over the next couple of years, because I think it's going to, I'd mentioned before the show, I think it is going to be a radical change. And I mean, like, radical because it's wild, but also like in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle style, like, this is radical, man. This is going to be very awesome.
Yeah, it has that quality to it. Living systems are, they take on a life of their own. So I can't wait to see how it unfolds as well.
Well, you know how I said at the start of the show, we're going to look up and it's going to be 40 minutes into it, and I want to be respectful of your time. Well, that is exactly where we're at, right on schedule. So, Shane, where are the best places for people to connect with you and the OCS and everything else?
We have a website as a starting point, okcircularsociety.com. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I see you've got my coordinates there. If anyone wants to read our blueprint, our economic transformation, our business plan, reach out to me. I'm more than happy to share it with people, and I always like to get input and people's experience of what they've read and potential ways where they might be able to help co-create this as well. This is really a community initiative, and through CoLab, we're also hosting a series of 3 community dialogues coming up in early October, I believe, and I'll be sharing that on my LinkedIn. So those are kind of the key places right there.
Awesome. Well, when those come up, I'll make sure to share them across the Peeled Back pages as well, so that anybody that's watched this can go back and be connected with that in some shape or form too.
Cool.
All right, my friend. Well, as I said, I've got the one question to wrap everything up. So I've got a time machine. We're going to hop in it, and we're going to go back 10 years. When the doors open, what's that one piece of advice you give to your younger self?
Great question. Gene, I think that one piece of advice is to trust myself, to listen to people, deeply listen to experts around me, friends, colleagues, mentors, family. But at the end of the day, do what's best for me. I listened to too many mentors that took me off track. Business mentors that didn't understand what we were doing, educators, professional people, and in reflection, a lot of those times it was, Shane, you knew what you were doing and you didn't trust yourself. And so listen to the people around you. Make sure that you're not not going off in some strange direction, and make wise choices. But listen to that inner direction, that inner guidance.
Oh, I
Even
love that.
even when it seems like beyond reach and that's way beyond what I could ever do. Trust that.
I love that piece of advice, and it's a great one, and everyone should listen to that. Again, brother, thank you so much for being on the show today. This has been a blast. And everybody else, thanks for watching episode 56. We'll be back next week with episode 57. Until then, I'm Gene, and this is Peeled Back's LiveCast Conversation with.
Cool. Thanks, Gene.